Yes, there we go. Okay, can everybody hear me fine? Okay, I'll try not to shout, which I usually do, but with a microphone I'll try to keep it as quiet as possible. So, welcome everybody. I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about flow bulkification and all of the other nice things you should know if you want to work with larger data sets in flows. So let me just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about in this session. I'll start with a brief introduction about me, about the topic, and why I think it's important to know about it as an admin, but also as a developer. I will then, I'm sorry, I have to talk about the order of execution. I know it's not the perfect topic for this heat, but I find it exciting. Then we will talk a bit about bulkification. What is it? Why is it important to know about it? And how do flows handle it? And then we'll go into some more considerations within flows when it comes to big data sets. I'll go into a bit of a demo as well, not just slides, but we'll actually go and log in and do a bit of testing and see some nice errors popping up and then see how those things could be fixed. And then I'll sum it up. So in order for you to know who is the person talking to you, this is me, 5 years younger, I think. I haven't gotten around to taking you a headshot. I've been in the Salesforce ecosystem for about 7.5-ish years. I've been part of bigger consultancies like Accenture. I've been part of small consultancies. Now I'm a freelance consultant and I'm also a certified trainer. So maybe if you ever consider going to an ADX, like the admin basic training or the DEX 403 app builder training, you might actually meet me there because I'm one of the few Germans who teach it. So if you prefer to listen to things in German, I will do that as well. And yeah, like I said, besides that, I'm a freelance consultant. I'm not a developer. I focus on declarative development, so anything you can do using the platform with point-and-click tools, so anything declarative. I do know a little bit about code because I think you should know about that if you want to be a technical consultant, but I'm not the person to write it. So yeah, that's what my focus is. And besides that, I thought I'd share a little fun fact. If I'm not busy with Salesforce, I try to escape out of rooms. I'm a very big escape room enthusiast, so if you want any tips, I actually work at an escape room on the weekend as an actress, so you can hit me up there, or I've played almost 100 rooms so far. I have a few tips. If you want some, feel free, but be prepared that I will rant on this forever. You won't shut me out once we start talking about either flows or escape rooms. Anyways, so let's get started with flows for now. Maybe in the future I'll do an escape room session if nobody else has other topics. Because I wanted to start off by talking about this topic and talking about why I think it is an important topic to talk about. First of all, flows are becoming more prominent and powerful by the minute. I feel like every day I log on to YouTube or something, I see a new article, flows can do this, flows can do that, flows here, flows there, flows are everywhere, right? And Salesforce has been pushing them for the last, I would say maybe 2-3 years, ever since they revamped it. They've been around forever. They were really ugly back then, a bit hard to use, but now they're really nice and very powerful. So we need to know about them. The thing is, what I love about flows is they are so easy to be built and they make automation very accessible to non-technical people, but they can be very dangerous. With a bad flow, you can basically break your org. Because there's a lot of things to consider. There are things going on in the background. There are limits to consider. And so while I love that it's so easily accessible, I also want to educate people around what their power is and also the considerations you need to keep in mind when you build them. And it will help you on your day-to-day basis if you understand what's going on under the hood of Salesforce. It will help you with performance issues your orgs might have. It will help you with a lot of troubleshooting. Who doesn't love a good error coming up and then being able to say right away, I know where this is coming from. This might actually help you with that. And last but not least, it's sort of fun to get into the nitty-gritty details of Salesforce. At least I like it. So, I mentioned it before. We are going to start off by talking about the order of execution. I know. That's what I felt the first time I heard about it, and all of the things that are going on behind the curtains. And I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I just want to give you a brief overview of what it is and what are some important things to know about it. Because I know we are quite a diverse audience, right? We've got admins here, we've got developers here. Some might know the order of execution by heart, some might never have heard about it. So what is it? The order of execution, I use the abbreviation OOE as a shortcut for it in the slide deck, just so you know. It basically describes all of the steps, all of the events that happen when somebody tries to manipulate the Salesforce database by creating a record, updating a record, deleting a record, undeleting a record, merging records, all those sorts of things. What's happening behind the curtain is the database is being manipulated. And there is a set of things that happen when this manipulation occurs. And the order of execution, it's not something that we set up or that we can configure. It's just the order of events that Salesforce performs upon that manipulation. So we need to know what's happening, and we need to know the order in which it is happening. And the manipulation of something in the database, like creating a record, it actually only is a successful creation if the order of execution can go all the way through without running into any errors. And we'll talk about some of those errors in a few minutes. So I've tried to simplify this as much as possible so that I don't go too much into details. And so I just wanted to point that out on the slide, that this is a partial or a part of the order of execution. I've put a link down there. You can find all of the order of execution steps in the documentation, obviously. But what I feel like is important to know is there are the three most important things of the order of execution is it's kicked off by a DML operation. I'm going to focus on inserting or updating a record. Deletion also has an order of execution. It's slightly different, so I'm not going to focus too much on that. Why is this mouse in the middle of the screen? Move. Now this is happening. Okay. Then at some point we have a temporary save. Okay, so this is basically where a user clicks on the save button, for example, and I sometimes kind of want to rename it to say try to save, because it doesn't really mean that it's an actual save. If you click it, things could go wrong. So we've got the DML operation a user kicks off by trying to save a record, or records coming in through an integration, through data load. Then at some point we have a temporary save. At this point, the record, if it's a new record, gets assigned an ID, or if it's an existing record, this is where we know about the ID. And then last but not least, we have a commit. This is when the save is actually successful, when the database is actually really being manipulated and things are stored there permanently. Now, between those three elements, things happen. We've got things that happen before the save. We've got things that happen between the save and the commit. We've got things that happen even after the commit. So those are basically the three areas in which things happen. And just to point out, I find them to be the most important to know about. Like I said, there are more steps than the ones that are on here. I think right now it's like 21 or 22 steps order of execution, so quite a lot of steps. So what happens before is things like validations. We want to make sure the record is actually valid. Required fields are filled, everything looks nice. So we've got system validation, like required fields, unique fields, those sorts of things. We've got logic we can run either in before save flows. There we've got our flows. We can have Apex triggers, and we have the custom validation. So validation rules we've written. And only if this goes as planned, we get to temporarily save the record. After the save, there is more logic that can happen. We've got after triggers. We still have them, workflows and processes. They are old, but they are still there. We've got the after save flows. We've got roll-up summary fields that are being calculated, and a few more things. And then after the commit, we have things happening like emails actually being sent out, outbound messages being sent out, those sorts of things. Okay. So that's order of execution in a nutshell. Now, there are a few things that I want to point out on this, which is when the order of execution hits off, and we get to the point, and you can sort of still see it in the background, we are in that after save area. We have workflows running, we have processes running, we've got flows running, and they can manipulate data again in Salesforce. You could use a flow to create a child opportunity for an account. You could use, when we used workflows or processes, you could have used them to update a field on the same record. So there are a few things that can happen. When the after save logic updates the record that triggered the order of execution, so the original thing, that means that parts of the order of execution will repeat. Let's say, for example, you have a very old workflow in your org that updates a field. That will mean we sort of go back here and repeat some of those steps, but just some of them. Not going to go into details on that for now. And also, when after save logic performs DML operations, creating a child record, updating a parent record, so manipulating any other records that are in the Salesforce database, on that other record, an order of execution will kick off. Okay. If an error occurs at any point, whether that's the original order of execution or any of the child record, parent records, if there's any error anywhere, the whole transaction rolls back. Okay, so we never get to the commit in that case. So this is the order of execution, and what it is that needs to finish successfully for our commit to happen is we need to have a transaction complete successfully. So everything that happens within here, even if this here maybe kicks off us going back or maybe going into another order of execution, all of this is happening within something that Salesforce calls a transaction. And that transaction is bound by something called the governor limits. Right? Salesforce is a cloud solution. We are in a multi-tenant architecture. We are sharing the servers with other companies that have their Salesforce orgs running. So Salesforce uses those governor limits to make sure everybody has enough resources at their hand to do their work. Right? So governor limits, if you know them, if you know how to handle them, they are actually, I like to say they are your friend. They make sure that you can do your work in Salesforce and not maybe another org compromises all of the resources a server has and you are stopped from working. And here's just some of them. I'm not going to go into those in detail. We will actually see two of them happening in a second. So things like the amount of SOQL queries, so searches that you can perform in Salesforce. You can have maximum 100 within a transaction. DML statements, so further manipulations of the database, creating records, updating records, 150, and other things. But this shouldn't be a talk about limits. So let's talk about bulkification. And we will have a bit of Q&A later on, but if you have any pressing questions in the meantime, feel free to just raise your hand. If there's anybody behind a plant, I can't see you, but okay, that's good. So, bulkification. Who knows what bulkification is? Just a quick show of hands. Who's heard the term bulkification? Oh, nice. Nice. Quite a few who are new to that topic. I like it. So, what's bulkification? Bulkification basically describes a concept where we make sure that any of the automations that we build are optimized to handle multiple records. And why do we do that? Because we want to try to consume the least amount of governor limits as possible. We want to avoid hitting those limits, because if we hit the limits, transaction fails, everything's rolled back, you've got a big mess. And it's not, the user doesn't really get a nice error and anything. So you want to avoid hitting those. So how does Salesforce handle larger data sets? When they are passed to Salesforce, let's say through a data load, you've got a list of 1,000 accounts, you load them into Salesforce, it could be 10,000, it could be 50,000, just a bigger set of data. Salesforce will break them up into batches to load them into Salesforce. You can fiddle with the batch size, but it can be a max size of 200 records. Now, we just heard that we have a transaction that is bound by governor limits. Now, the thing is, when we have these batches, each batch is going to be processed within one transaction. And that one transaction will still be bound by the same governor limits than if you were to just save one record. So if you have one record coming in, account comes in, is being inserted, we've got all of these things happening, right? We've got before save logic, after save logic. That's bound by one transaction with the governor limits like SOQL queries, DML statements for that one record. But the same thing is the case if we load multiple records into Salesforce. So let's say our set contains 3 records, 100 records, 150 records. That whole batch of data that comes in is still bound by the same amount of limits. So Salesforce doesn't care whether it is one record that you're giving to Salesforce or if it's 100. That limit of a maximum of 100 SOQL queries still applies, even if you were to create 100 records in one go. All right? And so bulkification basically means that we know about this and that we build our automation to be able to handle that, right? So that we don't consume too many governor limits. Now, when it comes to Salesforce, to flows, I actually quite early, I remember when they were revamped and everything, somebody told me, flows are bulkified. I'm like, oh, okay, what does that mean? I checked the documentation. It's not very specific. Well, it actually does go in a bit more detail. I don't want to get this wrong here. So they actually have quite a nice article. But the header of the article, which back then made me stop reading it, it says, you don't even have to think about bulkification. Flow interviews bulkify actions. I'm like, okay, so I guess I don't have to worry about it. But then I started thinking, I kind of still want to know what's happening, and if I really don't need to worry about it. So let's have a look at what Salesforce does in flows to make sure things are bulkified. When we talk about bulkification in flows, we talk about something, and it's actually in the header of the slide, called flows and flow interviews. And you can sort of think of them like objects and records. You know how we have an object, and then an instance of that object is called a record. You've got the object account, and then one single account is a record of that object. Now in Salesforce, we have flows and flow interviews. And a flow interview is basically an instance of a running flow. Okay? Sort of like a record is one instance of an object. For each record that triggers a flow, so if we send 200 accounts in, Salesforce will create a flow interview for every single one of those records, populating a global variable, which if you've worked with flows, you've seen it, $record. $record will be populated in every single flow interview for those 200 accounts that are being passed. And yes, if a flow is given multiple records, the records will be processed in their own flow interview. So if we have a single record, that's quite simple. The single record is passed to a flow. Salesforce will take that single record. In this case, it's an account called Nicklis Inc. And Salesforce will create a flow interview where $record.name would be Nicklis Inc. Quite simple. If we have multiple records, they will be passed to a flow, and the flow will spread them out across multiple flow interviews. So we'll have one flow interview where $record name is ABC Labs. The second one will be Nicklis Inc. The third one, of course, the best example was Ableton. I put it there, and now it's hidden underneath the thingy. Yeah, so it spreads it out across multiple flow interviews. Now, when our data is being handled in the flow interviews, those interviews, they will be processed on their own until they reach an element that is bulkified, until they reach a bulkified element. And the element that Salesforce bulkifies for us are the pink ones, elements that create records, update records, delete records, that look up records. So those are the four pink elements: create, update, delete, and get. And elements that send emails, which is sort of hidden here within the action element. So in that case, when such an element, and I'll show you an example, is reached, all of the flow interviews will wait. So every interview will be processed on its own until they reach such an element, and then they wait until the other interviews also reach that point. And then this element is only executed once, and not 200 times if you have 200 interviews. So let's have, actually, I'm going to show this with a second slide, because I think it's a bit easier to see here. So let's say we've got a flow. It starts, it sets some values, and then it creates, so this is started by an account being created. It sets opportunity values, and then it creates an opportunity record. And then we've got a bit more logic going down here. So what will happen if we were to pass a bigger data load? Salesforce will spread it out across multiple flow interviews. Every interview will execute the assignment element, because that's not a bulkified element. That stays in its own interview. Performed here, performed here, performed here. Then we've got a pink element. Pink elements are bulkified. So basically, these things, they happen in parallel. And then all flow interviews realize, we are reaching a point where we have a bulkified element. So they wait until all of the interviews have finished doing this. And then this create opportunity will only happen once, only consuming one DML statement. If it were to happen here and here and here, it would consume 3. So here it only consumes 1. That's what Salesforce means when they say things are bulkified in flows. It means that when you reach an element that is bulkified, the flow interviews, they go together, they do that action all together. Salesforce handles that for us. And then the result of that is again handed back to the flow interviews. So the flow interviews resume. And then maybe some of them, so in this case we have a decision element coming up, and we've got maybe some records that go this route, some records that go this route, and in that case we would have another bulkified element coming up. Okay. So that's actually what Salesforce means when they say that flows are bulkified. Okay. So Salesforce handles it all, right? Means I don't have to worry about anything, about hitting limits and flows, right? I see a few people smile. Of course you need to worry about things. So here are a few considerations to make around limits. Even though Salesforce does bulkify their elements, you can still build bad flows that will hit limits. And I'll show you a few in a second. Governor limits, they are shared across the entire transaction. So even if your flow doesn't consume the, let's say, 150 DML statements, you could have triggers running, you have maybe a workflow running, maybe you've got a process running, maybe you've got multiple flows running. They all share those limits, right? So that's something that you need to consider. You should never, ever place pink elements in loops. It's the easiest way to remember it. There are a few other things like quick actions. So that action element has a few actions that can be performed that also do DML statements like a quick action or those sorts of things. Please never, ever, ever place them into loops. If you do and I see it, I will come and haunt you down. That's a promise. Because what happens is that if you build a bad flow by placing such an element in a loop, the loop will go on and go on and go on, and every time consume 1 DML, 2 DMLs, 3 DMLs, 4 DMLs, and all of a sudden you've reached 150. If you think about it like this, 150 is not a lot. And there are some more limits around flows besides the governor limits. Governor limits are what bounds a transaction. Flows have a few of their own, a few limits of their own. The one that's most important is that we can only execute up to 2,000 elements at runtime of a flow. Okay, so if you build massive flows, and you might have seen some of those, 2,000 elements can be reached quickly, especially if you work with a lot of loops or loops within loops, right? So one of the considerations, and I'm going to talk a little bit more when I sum it up, is you could consider using some invocable Apex to do some heavy lifting. If you are realizing the way you're building something, sometimes you feel like you will have to place a pink element in a loop. Before you do, go talk to developers, see if they can maybe write you an invocable method that you can call that will do what you need without having to do that. If you're reaching those 2,000 elements that are being executed, then consider using invocable Apex. So, time for a bit of a demo. It is getting a bit hot up here, so I'm going to kneel down. Love this. That's what I missed during COVID. Being a trainer, that's one of the moves you do a lot. Like, oh, let me see. What's your error? Oh, now it's gone. Yeah. Okay, so let me go into my, I'm logged in. Let me just see. This is large enough, right? Yeah. So let me just show you some flows that are going to run into an error and how it could be avoided. So let me start off with this one. And I'll get this and this one. So the flows that I've built, most of them don't make a lot of sense in the content of what they do, but I built them in a way that I can show you some of the errors. So basically, what this flow is doing is for an account, it's going to get all of the opportunities. It's going to loop through all of the opportunities and clone it, right? So just for the sake of the demo, I have created an opportunity, governor limits because of loop, an account with governor limits because of loop. And if you look at it, it has exactly 150 opportunities, right? And for the sake of the demo, I'm starting this off by getting that specific account. Don't hard code IDs, not a good idea, but for the demo, I've done it. So what do you think? Which limit am I going to reach with this? Am I going to reach a limit? Which limit am I going to reach? Am I going to reach the DML operation? Let's give it a try. So let's give it a go. Failed? Yes, it failed, just when I wanted. But now the interesting part is, why did it fail? Let me kill the tip here. It failed on this element, and it failed. That's interesting. Why did this fail? Now this is a bit hidden here. Why did this fail? It fails because it says we have reached a governor limit, so we've got a limit exception of 101 SOCL queries. I'm only doing this once, right? What's the problem here? Why am I still hitting a limit? Because otherwise the flow would be okay. I have an opportunity trigger running, and that seems to perform some queries. So while my flow in itself, it's still a bad practice, because you know this here, a pink element in a loop, Nora will come and haunt you down, not a good idea. This would still work because I would be exactly on the 150 DML statement limit. But this goes to show that when we think about limits, we should not only think about the flow that we are building, but everything that's going on within the order of execution. Because that's what's being bound by the governor limit. So what we've got in the background is a very, very, very simple trigger that only does one thing, is it just executes a SOCL. Right? And it does that every time before an opportunity is inserted. Since we're looping through, in every loop, we are creating an opportunity that's an insert every time this is being executed, and there we go. So if I were to comment that out, and I'm going to just debug this again. Let me just see. Completed. No limit hit. Still not a good idea, because while this might work, the moment that somebody goes in and creates another opportunity, so I'm just going to say Nora's killer op. It's closing today. One, of course, obviously, I won it. No amount, but I won the opportunity. I debug again. And this time, because now we have 151 opportunities, it fails. Right? So if I scroll down all the way to the bottom, we'll see here too many DML statements, 151. Okay? So while Salesforce still bulkifies flows for us, the way we built this matters. So instead of building things like this, what you would try to do in such a case, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, is work with variables, set the opportunity values, put them into a collection, and maybe at a later point we can do a session on more details of this. So today is not about learning how to do those things, but just understanding the concepts, and then performing one DML upon the whole collection. Because that only consumes one DML statement, no matter if in the collection you have one record of 50 or 100. It's one statement that you do, whereas before we would have done 150, and with a 151st it got killed. Okay, so this just goes to show that even though Salesforce does bulkify flows, you still need to think about your data sets, about the size of data that you have and that you're handling within that. One more thing that I want to point out, so what I've talked about so far was focusing on auto-launched flows. Auto-launched flows could be record-triggered flows, could be schedule-triggered flows, right? Screen flows behave a little bit differently. So in screen flows, everything that happens between two screen elements is considered as one transaction. Okay, so it's not the whole flow that's bound by a transaction, because a screen flow, it's not being triggered by a record being saved, which kicks off the order of execution. It's usually being triggered by having it on a page or clicking a button and then opening the flow. It usually starts off with some logic or maybe a screen, and then afterwards you've got some logic that executes. All of the logic that executes between two screens is being bound by one transaction and by all of the limits that go within that transaction. When it hits a new screen, the transaction finishes, so everything is committed, transaction finishes, and the limits are reset. This is something that's interesting to know, because you can actually use it to avoid hitting limits in screen flows. You can put a screen element in between that will sort of pause for a second. A user maybe has to confirm something, and then it will keep on going. So I have a little demo on this, and then we're going to sum this up. I'm going to kneel down again in front of my computer. No, I'm good. I'm going to propose, dear MacBook, my beloved MacBook. So let me just pull up two screen flows. One that's not a good idea, no limit reset. So this one, basically, I try to get used to auto layout, but sometimes it's just a very long thingy. But I'm getting there, because I do like the approach. So basically what this does is we have a screen, nothing's on there, right? It's an empty screen. Then we're going to get all of the accounts that are active, which, just so you see, we've got, I actually put a report on it so we can see it. I think 300 and something, 320. So this is going to get 320 accounts. And it's going to loop through those accounts and do some logic, right? If you look in here, you won't see any pink elements. So, should be fine. No governor limit. This is a screen flow. So it's not triggered by saving a record, but it would be triggered by somebody clicking a button or something. So I mentioned earlier, besides the governor limits, there's other limits that we need to consider. There's a flow limit. Maximum elements that can be executed at runtime is 2,000. If we get 320 records here and we have I think I put 10, you can probably do the math. This is going to be above 2,000. If you have a 320 times 10, or actually 11, right? So if I run this, I'm going to click on debug real quick. This is going to run for a second, and then it will hit a limit. Won't be a governor limit this time. For some reason, it's not as descriptive as before. It says you've exceeded the maximum limit for this feature, and then in the email you get, or at the bottom of this thing, it will say something like maximum iterations exceeded, I think. Number of iterations exceeded, right? So if I build this flow slightly different, and this is the one that I built. I basically do the same flow. We're getting an account, we're getting all of the accounts, we're looping through the accounts. But every time I loop, I'm increasing a counter so that I realize when I am hitting a certain limit or before I'm hitting a certain limit. And here in the loop, I'm having a check that says, is the counter, I put 1,990 because I didn't want to count every time and then do this every time, so just to make things easier. So this is basically checking, am I about to hit the limit? And if yes, it's going to route me to another screen, which will reset the limit. I'll make a quick pause, the user would have to do something, and then you can continue. So the same flow, I'm going to hit debug here. It'll run and run and run. It'll show us a second flow that says limit reset, the second screen, limit reset. And then I can click next and it will finish the whole thing. Yeah.
I know it's stupid from the user perspective, but like purely theoretical, does it mean that you can use like an empty screen in order to avoid hitting the governance limit?
So what's important to understand about this is that this whole placing a screen in between to reset limits, it only works within screen flows. The things we talked about before were auto-launch flows. So by a record saving, for example, by data load coming in and creating, updating records. There we don't have any screen elements. So there it's not possible to do any resets.
Right, but I'm saying like building some flow that will be triggered for a button and then like some, I don't know, empty screen or whatever, and then you would just basically have the same logic that you would have in the
Yeah.
screen.
Yeah.
So that could actually work. Right?
Yeah, it could work. You could prompt something like to the user, like, do you want to, you've processed, I don't know, 2,000 accounts, do you want to keep going? You could say yes, you could say no, you could do things like that. All right?
You can do even better. So there is something that's called flow action. So there is this Aura component that is available on unofficial SF. You install it in your Aura and it acts because in screen flows, apart from screens, you can also use flow actions or local actions which are built using Aura components to break the transaction. It basically completes the transaction. So screen or either an action completes the transaction.
Yeah. And so that action, it would basically then just get rid of the screen. So it would be sort of like, imagine like an invisible thing coming up. So you wouldn't actually have to prompt. Thanks for pointing that out. Unofficial SF, amazing website. Go and check it out. I have a ton of components that I use from them. Okay, so just a quick summary. Flows are bulkified by Salesforce, yes, but you still need to pay attention on how you build them. Because as you just saw, you can still break things. I've said it a few times. Do not put elements in loops that manipulate the database, mainly the pink elements and some actions. It depends a bit on the actions that you place. Avoid having multiple automations run on one object. Now, this might actually be a great prompt for one of the breakout discussions. I heard Victor say earlier, like when to go with which automation tool. I personally think that on one object, you should only have one of them. So you should either go for flows or put everything in a trigger. Maybe consider an approach where you've got the flows, manage your logic and call invocable apex, things like that. But try to avoid having multiple automations run on one object, because then it will get complex very quickly. You won't know what is consuming your limits.
But if there are like multiple flows or there's a process and a flow on the same object, wouldn't it be considered as separate transactions?
No, because it's all within the order of execution. everything that happens in the order of execution is bound by that one transaction. So you could have a before save flow, before save trigger, after save flow, after trigger, process, workflow. All of them run, all of them can consume your limits, and they are all within that one single transaction.
But if, like, say, one process is triggered by record creation and another one is by record update, it would still be considered as, like, same transaction?
No, because then, so it depends on what the record is that's coming into your database. If it's a record that's being created, all of the logic runs that's for creation of a record, before create or after create. If you have logic that only runs for updates, that wouldn't run if a record is created. Okay. And I've put it here, consider working with invocable Apex actions in flows to either monitor or handle limit consumption, right? Okay, that's it. Questions? Yes. Oh, we have a microphone because we're recording this, and it's coming to you.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation. I have a couple of questions regarding those flow limits. First of all, you mentioned that Salesforce has this 2,000 elements limit for very flow specific limit. Is it a limit for a flow interview or cumulative limit for a transaction?
I love that you asked that question, because I had that question and I've been on a mission to get the answer, because it doesn't say in the official documentation. I've run a few tests myself and I'm 95% sure that it's per interview. So I've run different kinds of flows where in one I pass a collection into the flow and then have multiple elements run, and that doesn't hit the limit. If I do a get in the beginning and it gets, 200 accounts and then loops through them, it hits the limit. So I'm 95% sure that it's per interview. I'm still waiting for anybody from Salesforce to confirm. So if you've got connections, tell them.
Okay, thank you. And second question is also regarding those that limit. I know that it's possible in Apex to kind of check using the standard limits class how much of those limits you already consumed. Is it possible to check these flow limits?
Not natively, so the flow doesn't have a function that you could call, but you could consider using invocable Apex that will run that check for you and pass the results back. So you'd have an invocable method that basically just runs a check, passes you the results back, and then you can put them into a decision element and see what you want to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I think there was a question somewhere up here, Victor, behind the plant, through the plant.
Question is about the get records element. Are those get records always bulkified, or there are some, or not bulkified, or there are some corner cases where you can make a really complex query that will not be bulkified?
Can you rephrase?
So what about bulkification of get records elements? Are they always bulkified or not?
So I'm going to say, yes, they are bulkified in flows. However, if you put them into a loop, so the bulkification goes to say, if Salesforce receives 200 accounts and it does a flow that contains a get element, one get element, that will only be executed once. So it is bulkified, yes. But if you have a more complex flow, where you do some logic and then you have a collection of, child opportunities. You want to loop through those and then get a certain product for each opportunity. So if you put a get into a loop, I would still say it is bulkified because that element across those flow interviews would only be executed once within each iteration of the loop. So I don't know if that answers your question. It will, because it will probably still hit a limit if you use them incorrectly.
Question was, is it possible to have a get element like inside, like on its own, so complex that it will not be bulkified for some reason?
No.
Because the platform doesn't give you that much of flexibility to break it actually. In
90.
most of the never say never.
95%.
So in 99% of the cases, it will work.
Great, thank you.
I think if you turn back a little bit, there is a...
Hello, Nora. Thanks so much for the presentation. It was really nice. I have a question regarding flows and platform events. Does it help to increase the limits?
Do the platform events help
To increase the limits? Yeah.
No. The limits, they are per transaction. So what you can do in the flow, you can either have a flow react on a platform event happening, or you can have a flow that generates a platform event. But the logic within the flow is still bound by that concept of a transaction.
Even if I put the logic inside the platform event? If I put the logic inside the platform event, because I'm calling the platform event and calling the object, creating the object platform event, and put the logic inside that you run it, does the platform event doesn't roll in parallel with the flow?
So if you have a flow that, so from what I understand is you would have a flow that executes on a platform event being created and then have logic in that flow that will execute.
No, I mean like imagine like I'm reaching the limits of the flow or for some reason, and I want to instead of refactoring the flow and building a platform event so I can put partially of the business logic inside the platform event, would it be possible to increase those limits?
I don't, yeah, maybe Miranda has a...
Thank you. So I understand your question. You are basically trying to use platform events to orchestrate the logic which is very heavy and put them in a separate transaction. So the answer to your question would be yes. So what you can do is let the normal transaction, let a record triggered flow fire a platform event, and then you have another flow which handles or triggers on platform event creation, and then that flow takes care of the logic. So this way you can break your heavy logic into multiple transactions and make it kind of async.
But would that only work if it's an after commit platform event?
Yes, because you cannot create records inside a before save flow. So essentially you will have to do it in an after save context.
No, I meant the platform event itself, because you can have them fire immediately or after commit. Does that make a difference in that case?
Yeah, you would have to choose if you want to make sure. So the platform, basically what she's asking is, when you have a platform event, when you create the platform event in your org, you are provided with two choices, that if you are creating the platform event, should it fire immediately or should it fire after the transaction is completed? So it depends on what's the use case is. For example, logging. In logging, you might want to use immediately, but normally if you want to process business logic, in that case, it's preferred to fire the platform event after the whole transaction is finished. So that transaction is finished and the platform event then takes care of the heavy lifting. But do mind that that logic is being processed in a separate transaction. So you will not see the results on the UI immediately. You would have to probably refresh the screen to see the results.
And maybe that's something that we can dig further into when we do the breakout sessions, because I think I've already gone over time a little bit, and I'm melting up here. I think if we don't have any other pressing questions, we'll be around. We'll have the breakout sessions. If you have any other questions, feel free to let me know. So yes, feel free to connect. Thank you for listening to my talk. And I'll see you in a second in the breakout session.